Hello, Austrian Leninist here. Today we have our first suggested video. Some random Marxist in the comments suggested that I debunk this video and he linked to it. And so yeah, I'm gonna debunk it. We're gonna look into it. I'm just gonna skip over the mediocre explanations of Marxism and so on, and we'll just take a look at it. Alright, so here we go.
You know, in a perfect society, everyone would have equal access to food, shelter, and every other form of basic resource necessary, not only for survival, but for living a good quality life. In a truly realized utopia, there would be not the smallest hint of racism, sexism, and every other form of discrimination and oppression. And at the very core of this utopian imagining of the world would be, well, communism.
Alright, I think this guy got it figured out. I don't need to talk about this anymore. Video just ends now. Okay, thanks, bye, I'm done here.
Ist mir egal, mit wem du chillst. Schlaf auf jedem Klo mit jedem Typen, den du willst.
But wait, on the other hand, the video is also called 5 Reasons Why Communism Can't Work, so he probably is gonna go full capitalist right now.
Or at least it would be if history had not, from time to time again, proved communism to be rather incapable in its quest for realizing an advanced and absolute egalitarian society. While communism has evolved to be a particularly complex, convoluted, and nuanced concept, both of economy and politics, almost everybody who has heard of the word has a basic, albeit simple understanding of the kind of society it imagines.
Wrong, actually most people have no clue what communism and Marxism is even about.
Simply put, communism pushes for a world governed by absolute egalitarianism more than anything else. Communism aims to enable a global society where every member has equal access to the fruits and benefits derived from labor. Communism, most recognizably, ends in socio-political and economical equality realized through the elimination of, well, private property. And communism is the sworn enemy of capitalism. Built on the cornerstone of social equality, communism, since its inception, has always been an attractive alternative to the predominantly capitalist mode of society that is embedded in most of the modern world. But if communism was such a noble idea, then why hasn't it replaced capitalism as the dominant force that drives global economy?
Maybe because the bourgeoisie and the capitalists, like America, tried to desperately kill off communism.
And can it ever, in fact, replace capitalism in this regard?
I don't know, man. I never thought about replacing capitalism before. Why hasn't anybody tried to do this before?
If in theory communism was all about egalitarianism, then why in practice has it yielded only unstable dictatorial governments? Governments that have bestowed absolute material wealth to the rulers and crushing poverty to the masses.
You know, corruption by the officials isn't really something communism is to blame for. It's people's own greed to blame for. And also, that picture of a slum or something, I'm pretty damn sure that that's a picture from Africa, not any communist country.
To arrive at answers to these questions, it is imperative that we not only define communism, but take a focused look into every nook and cranny of its crumbling establishment. And as with most things with a long, complicated history, the best place to start is where it all began. London, 1848. Let's get into a little bit about the Cold War. If history has any indication of its political tendencies, communism often sets itself as a cornerstone to totalitarian dictatorships.
I am already triggered as fuck, because this guy seems to be very neutral, yet he uses Adolf Hitler as an example of socialism.
Understandably, the advocacy of communism that enables violent revolutions worldwide.
I think this guy doesn't understand the definition of a revolution. Like, if you have a revolution, of course it's gonna be violent, so why do you call it a violent revolution? I have yet to see a non-violent political revolution. Like, take even the French Revolution, the Holy First Revolution for that matter. They also kill people violently, so why do you keep naming it violent revolution?
Along with its prominent history of authoritarianism, has made it a sworn enemy of the many countries who value a democratic government and free market society. This geopolitical tension between communist republics and democratic nations.
As always, we have a guy that calls Western nations democratic nations instead of calling it a Western nation or simply a capitalist nation. completely ignoring the fact that the Soviets and all socialists pretty much value democracy to some extent, as I have talked about in my first video.
Has in recent history given rise to the Cold War between the United States and the then USSR. It took 5 long decades, but it was the Cold War that ultimately ended the USSR in 1991. The Cold War started sometime in 1945 at the tail end of World War II. The Cold War was marked by the relative absence of any large-scale fighting between the two sides. It remained a top international concern, however, because both the USA and the USSR engaged in an unprecedented arms race. Both parties were developing at an alarming pace overkill retaliatory weapons that could easily result in mass destruction. As a result, both countries fully engaged in legitimate scare tactics that have kept each other in line. And this all ended in 1991 with the collapse of the USSR. Now let's get into a little bit about modern communism. It was discourses of Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto that gave rise to modern communism. Hence, communism is often referred to as Marxism. Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848. At its very core, Marxist ideals are relatively simple: to free the poor from poverty by allowing the existence of a truly egalitarian society. The very means that Marx proposed to achieve these ends, however, was a different story. Simply put, Karl Marx believed that a true communist society should rise from the ashes of capitalism.
Okay, now what the actual fuck is that?
In order to truly liberate the lower class from poverty, Marxism advocates for a violent revolution that will result in the total destruction of any existing systems besides communism. Following the hypothetical dismantling of capitalism, Marx would then push for a dictatorial takeover on the means of production in every segment of society. According to Marx, it is imperative that a dictatorial government gain absolute control over its citizens. Marx imagined an all-encompassing control that would allow the state to make personal decisions for its citizens. Marx's idea of state control extended to education and employment, religion and marriage, and virtually every personal choice that could potentially affect the society.
Well, yeah, because almost every aspect of capitalist society has some unavoidable flaws. Also, I love how he uses a picture of marriage, although the USSR had very good reforms on marriage, like allowing women to divorce, or making it possible for non-religious people to marry in the first place, or to officially marry in the first place. You know, with a register office and so on.
This communist dictatorship, according to Marx, should also take charge in the collectivization of property and wealth. Marx believed that it is only after these prerequisites are met that the true communist utopia can be realized. Now, it is important to note that Karl Marx died before any of his theories can be proven in practice. While there were many nations that adopted a communist setup in the past, the utopia Marx envisioned has yet to be achieved.
You know what's so nice about capitalists trying to dismiss communism? At least they are consistently using the same bad arguments, which in fact makes it easier to do my job. But for those of you who haven't noticed, he was using the "but communism has never worked yet," or "communism has been tried." No, it has not been tried. Socialism has been tried.
Much of the difficulty in realizing Marx's communist utopia lies in the violent global implementation that Marxism seeks to enforce, because only by destroying every non-communist society will communism finally succeed in building a classless society. But it has become quite the irony, however, that the long-standing ideas of democracy and free market economy, which Marxism seeks to overthrow from the very beginning, proved to be the defining force responsible in overthrowing Marxism in once communist countries.
I can't really tell if he's actually that stupid to not realize that it's not democracy or the free market that overthrew socialism, it's the bourgeoisie in America. But I'm just gonna assume that he's really that stupid. Or at least he's biased towards communism, which is pretty much stupidity set up by the West.
And it is a curious question, therefore, what are the weakest points in the communist establishment that ultimately allowed it to collapse upon itself? So here are 5 reasons why communism, at the end of the day, proved to be a really dumb, stupid idea.
Alright, so after ages of small talk, we get to the real thing.
Number 1, forced collectivization. Collectivization was an anti-private farming policy adopted by the USSR in an effort to facilitate the equitable distribution of agricultural produce, all while reducing the economic power of the kulaks or the prosperous proletariat. The forced collectivization law was most intensely pursued between 1928 and 1940, which coincided with Stalin's rise to power. Following Marxist doctrines, the USSR believed that forced collectivization would maximize the agricultural resources in the countryside. At the same time the collectivization law was pursued, Russian industry was taking off at an unbelievable pace, and great stores of food were necessary to feed the growing workforce. At the beginning of the 1930s, a vast majority of agricultural farms were forcibly enrolled in the collectivization program. This meant that all items produced on the farm were equally distributed among the population.
Well, actually, that sounds like a nice idea to me, so what's he gonna talk about?
Naturally, this policy was met by vicious masses of resisting landowners, most of whom were the small-time farmers who tilled their own lands.
I'd like to hear this guy's explanation how you can be a landowner that has so much land that he doesn't want to collectivize it and be a small-time farmer at the same time. Basically, he's defending kulaks here.
To counteract this resistance, Stalin swiftly sent out executioners to get rid of those who opposed the collectivization efforts. This led to tens of millions of people who starved to death. The state's reacquisition of private farms was largely paid for by the working class, some tens of millions of whom famished to death in the first 5 years of forced collectivization.
You know, this is just an assumption, but maybe the 5-year plans didn't consider that the kulaks are fucking selfish assholes. Like, if you are working after a 5-year plan and the kulaks won't fucking work, then the 5-year plan is screwed. So it's their own fault that they are starving. I mean, sure, those who already collectivized, they got screwed over as well, but it's mainly the kulaks' fault for refusing.
Chinese farmers were met with the same fate in the 1960s, which left 33 million people starving to their deaths. The forced collectivization in China was arguably the single worst famine in recent human history.
Not really, considering that famines were a thing in China almost every 10 years or so. And you know what, I will leave a link to Vanguard Radio's video about the history of China in the description so you can check out the whole famine stuff.
Next, lack of basic human rights. Communism in theory is a philosophical imagining of a utopian society where citizens of the state are ultimately able to share resources and benefits according to need, where property serves as the common good for all, and where citizens engage in work motivated by personal desire rather than economic need. Communism in practice, however, has realized only authoritarian societies so far, where individual rights suffer for collective progress. Fundamental commonplace ideals like freedom of speech and artistic expression among others pose a great threat to a communist society.
Okay, I'm just gonna play the why would you censor that game, okay? Here we have Van Gogh's famous Starry Night. Here we have a young soldier that is thoughtfully thinking about the existence of the human race. Here we have a man and a woman having a great time as lovers. That's a picture of a squirrel wishing you a great birthday, but that's not the point. The thing is, the USSR really has no reason to censor art unless it's portraying capitalism or Nazism in a good light. And speaking of Nazism, freedom of speech isn't always a great thing because it gives fascists a platform.
The blatant disregard for fundamental civil rights is at the very heart of the collapse of the Marxist governments in former communist states. The above-mentioned forced collectivization policy, for example, is a dangerous practice in circumventing human rights. Number 3, failure to adapt. Among the most prominent reasons why a Marxist setup of society tends to collapse upon itself is because of its inability to adapt to the changing conditions that exists outside of its prescribed reality. For instance, the fluctuation that occurs in a free market economy is a real-world riddle that Marxism economists were unable to solve. A Marxist approach to understanding the market fails to take into account the market prices of commodities. Without access to the checks and balances of the prices of commodities, it was unable to properly distribute its national resources.
Alright, this one is more of the advanced points he makes. And actually, I think I've seen a lot of people that, as well as he said, don't really understand how we can deal with commodities, basically. But I wouldn't automatically assume that there is no one out there that knows how we could solve that problem.
Next, lack of creativity. A Marxist-informed state by design values utilitarianism over anything else. Marxist utilitarianism basically means that for every action performed by a citizen, there must be a resulting contribution to the empowerment of the state. Communist nations have little to no use for artistic endeavors such as the writing of literature, sculpture, and painting, among others.
Yeah, but besides literature, we don't really need art or sculpture, really. It's just a nice thing to have, by the way. And I think that the point he was making there is kind of ridiculous, because in most cases people get creative out of need. And because a lot of people like to use the internet on, oh wow, capitalism is so creative, the Soviets also had computers and they were also planning on doing internet.
Needless to say, such thinking has allowed communist governments to violently undermine the individual aspirations of its citizens. Whatever work of art that is created in a communist society is only allowed to exist by the government to serve a singular purpose, and a singular purpose only: to hail the Communist Party.
Okay, now explain to me, how does that hail the Communist Party? Or how does this one hail the Communist Party? Or even this one? Because women are allowed to work?
And on the other hand, artists who oppose the Communist Party are perceived as threats and are immediately eliminated. Finally, Marxism was a bad idea from the very start. A likely explanation to the failures of communism, both as an economic and political establishment, is that Karl Marx is basically a moron.
You know, I could also say that you're basically a moron and end the video right now, but you probably are making another point here.
Much of the economic philosophies of Marxism are deeply rooted in the labor theory of value. Simply put, the theory predicts that relative value of commodity based on the amount of labor that was needed for its production. It asserts that, for example, a car should cost more than a pair of sneakers simply because more labor was necessary in the production of a car than a pair of sneakers. While that equation might sound reasonable on the surface, it is too overly simplified. For example, let's take that iPhone you all have. There are other cell phones out there that pretty much match the performance in every single specification of the more popular iPhone, yet the iPhone retails for twice as much. I mean, the cost of materials and labor between the two phones are pretty similar, yet people gladly pay twice as much for an iPhone.
Once again, I don't really see the point he was trying to make here. In fact, the point he was making there was more pro-socialist than pro-capitalist. Because he basically pointed out that the labor time is the same and that most other smartphones can also do the same.
The same is true for medicine and with almost every commodity in the market, because the real-world economy dictates that the price of a product is motivated by its supply and demand. But to Marx, he saw communism as the final evolution of social progression. He believed that the world was bound to evolve from primitive civilizations to masters and slave societies to feudal kingdoms to capitalist countries to socialist nations until eventually to a singular egalitarian communist utopia. But there exists a larger world outside Karl Marx's mind, a world that might not be a utopia in any shape or form, but a much real world nonetheless, peopled by those who live through real world abuses driven by political and economic inequality. And let's just take the real world examples. I mean, would you like to live in North Korea?
I like how he's implying that North Korea is a horrible place from the start. And if there wasn't so much fucking embargoes ruining North Korea's economy, I would gladly live there. If I spoke North Korean, of course.
Even in China, where it looks very successful and growing and modern from the surface, you still could be arrested for talking about Tibetan freedom or Taiwan independence or Falun Gong or even having a Bible study in your home. Anyway, I made this video because a lot of people were messaging me asking me to talk about communism, so hopefully you guys found this helpful. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you later.
Alright, basically to sum it up, he was trying to dismiss communism with points I've heard over and over before. And the only real point he made there is that Marx is stupid and that commodity production wasn't really managed well. And I'll give him that. I have no clue about commodities just yet, maybe I get into it. But it's kinda bad if 1 out of 5 points is effective and the other 4 are just dismissible. So yeah, that's the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see each other in the next one. Thanks a lot for watching. If you liked the video or if you'd like to show support, leave a like and a subscribe below. Also, feel free to post a comment or share this on social media.